When NATO announced plans to launch a €1 billion innovation fund back in 2022, heads turned. €1 billion to invest in defence and security, backed by 24 countries. At the time, most European VCs were still incredibly wary of backing defence companies, and nothing like this had ever been attempted before. Joining me on the Sifted Podcast today to discuss how it's going 3 years on is Dame Fiona Murray, current chair and former vice chair of the NATO Innovation Fund, or NIF, and Associate Dean for Innovation at the MIT Sloan School of Management. In its portfolio, NIF counts several of Europe's most exciting deep tech and defence companies, including unmanned robotic startup ARX Robotics and space tech ISAR Aerospace, along with several VC funds, including V Squared, OTB Ventures and Twin Track Ventures. Launching NIF has not been a smooth ride, although perhaps it would be naive to think it ever could have been. Since its start in 2023, NIF has seen 4 out of 5 of its original founding partners leave, one of whom recently took the organisation to court in a dispute over compensation, while its former chair, investor Klaus Hommels, moved into a new role in September. We'll get into NIF's stories so far and plans for the next few years in the pod today. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us.
Amy, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's nice to be here.
So you took on the chair role a few months ago. What's your mission?
So the mission that I have for NIF is very much to respond to the call that the Secretary-General Mark Rutte made, I think, to everybody yesterday in his speech in Germany when he said, to be crystal clear about the threat, we're Russia's next target and we're already in harm's way. And NATO has put a considerable trust in us that we take really seriously to build out NATO's technological edge and to make sure that we invest in companies that are bringing absolutely the best technology into the hands of our individual ministries of defence, our citizens, so that we are as strong as we can possibly be in what I think is going to be a quite challenging future.
And it must be an incredibly interesting role being chair of the fund. What does it actually involve day to day, week to week? Who are you spending time with? What kind of decisions are you making?
So first, it's an incredible honour. I'm really delighted to take on this responsibility. The responsibility of the board is to make sure that we set out the broad direction for the fund, a direction that is in accordance with what our limited partners, those 24 nations, absolutely want. And to be sure that we have the best team in place to make independent investment decisions. So it's the job of the partners to make those investment decisions, but we have a deep responsibility to build out a fund that can raise additional capital in the future, that is aligned with NATO's core priorities, and that can really support our portfolio companies and funds over the long run. So I spend my time making sure that we understand our limited partners. They, of course, are reporting back to their ministries, their treasuries. I make sure that with my board colleagues that we put into place all the governance that we need and that we create the most high-performing organisation. Right? We want to adhere to the highest market standards in venture capital. And so my responsibility is to make sure that we have the best people able to do that.
And are the LPs, are they all the defence departments of different countries, or is it country by country dependent?
It's country by country dependent, but I would say our LPs, each of them are representing their nation. So all 24 nations are represented by around the table. And so when I chair the LPAG, our Limited Partner Advisory Committee, I'm absolutely chairing a meeting that has 24 nations represented with their sort of country names in front of them. So they are absolutely there representing their country, not so much as individuals. About half of them come from ministries of defence. And so they will often be talking about capabilities. Are we investing in companies that can bring them the capabilities that they need? And the other half are often represented by their sovereign wealth funds. And so they often bring more financial sophistication to the table. But regardless of where they're coming from, they're representing the aspirations of their countries. We have to remember that the money that they contribute to the NATO Innovation Fund is money that counts towards their 3% defence spending targets. And so they want that to be seen as an investment in capabilities, in the innovation ecosystems, and in sort of long-term capacity to really deploy extraordinary technology.
And how central do most of them see technology being to, I guess, Europe's security? How embedded is the kind of the need for innovation, the need for new kinds of defence companies to be supported, to be funded, to fit into the infrastructure that we have today? Where are they all on the spectrum of kind of recognising that's importance?
I think all of our 24 nations appreciate that in defence, security and resilience, we absolutely need cutting-edge technology, that the technologies of the past won't solve the problems, not least because our adversaries are working incredibly hard at the technological frontier, and so we have to be at that frontier or even beyond that. I think the question that all of our countries are asking is, where are we going to get that cutting-edge technology from? Where will those capabilities be developed? And the recognition that perhaps was part of why NIF was created in the first place was that it was going to be in the hands of startups, that we were going to get that sort of pace and private sector ingenuity. And so that's really been, I think, one of the big shifts, is recognising the defence primes, the large industrial companies have their place, but it's really in the hands of startups that those capabilities are going to be sharpened and developed rapidly. I think all of our nations see that. The journey that they're all on is being good customers. Can they be good customers for those capabilities? Can they, we use the expression pull through. Can they pull through those capabilities, put contracts on the table so that there's a market for those new technologies? And different countries are on a different place in that journey.
What's an example of a country that's done the being a good customer part well?
So I think at least two come to mind. So Estonia, I think, has been an extremely good customer. They have a few things going for them. They're small, and quite often small nations, they might not have a lot of money to spend, but because their system is small, they can often make decisions more quickly. So Estonia has been a very good customer, I would say, particularly in areas like cybersecurity. So they're, and sort of some of those sorts of technology. So they have started to lead the way in how to do that. A country like Germany, which had very low defence spending and really hadn't engaged with their startups. Increasingly, Germany is starting to put contracts on the table, begin to do exercises, do testing and evaluation. And so we're really seeing Germany make an incredibly important and rapid move to the forefront as a really good customer for defence technology. The UK has also been doing some very important work around reorganising defence innovation as part of its new National Armaments Directorate and so on, really trying to take some of the best of their work in places like Ukraine and think about what that means for the whole of the military.
Interesting. And of the €1 billion NIF has, how much has been deployed and what is actually the time scale for that? Is it the usual VC fund?
So our formal deployment schedule is to deploy about 100 million a year. Now, obviously, that means that we would be doing that $1 billion over 10 years. We're trying to bring that forward because we have quite a strong sense of urgency. But we're on track with deploying at least 100 million a year. And the way that we do that is 80% of that goes to what we call direct investments, so making equity investments in startups. And the other 20% goes into investments in funds, so something that's called fund of funds, where we say, look, we're not going to have the ability to see every single company and make all those direct investments. Let's find some of the best funds. Some of them are new. Some of them are perhaps on a subsequent fund. Some of them are moving into defence, security and resilience. Let's invest in those and support them and their portfolio companies. And so that gives us amazing exposure to over 100 and something startups.
And how many startups, direct investments have you done now, and how many funds are in the portfolio?
So I think, to get my numbers straight, officially we've done 14 direct investments and we've invested in 9 funds in total. And what's really interesting is, to date, I think there'll be some new announcements sort of before the end of this year, but in our over sort of 150 or so million that we've deployed and that's official and public, we've actually crowded in co-investment of about €1.4 billion, which means that, for every euro that we're putting in, other people are kind of coming on this journey with us. And that's extremely important because we can't do this on our own.
And who's leaning most heavily in? Who are the other investors that you are crowding in? Is it VCs who, as I said in the intro, we've seen, a huge uptick in interest in this industry, although lots still won't invest in defence and security? Is it industry? Is it other public funds?
So if you look at that sort of 1.4 billion of co-investment, we're seeing that largely come from other funds. So certainly with our direct investments, most of the people that we co-invested with are other venture capital funds. And so we're really beginning to see some of these VC funds come to the table and start to put more money into these exciting companies. And then when we're investing in fund of funds, we ourselves are acting as a limited partner. And we're definitely seeing other limited partners. So that would be sovereign wealth funds, some of the pension funds, insurance funds, and interestingly, high net worth individuals, some of the families across Europe who recognise that investing in the future resilience of Europe and of NATO is an incredibly important mission.
And what about industry? Where does where do the traditional defence primes, but also big manufacturers, we know Europe has a huge history and a huge strength there. How much, what role are they playing in, the kind of revolution of Europe's defence ecosystem? And where would you like them to see them play more of a role?
So if I take a step back, I think sometimes people think, should we have big companies and defence primes or should we have startups? And I think the reality that we're going to see in the long run is that we need incredibly creative and mutually supporting partnerships between those two parts of our economy. We need to couple the private sector ingenuity and pace of the entrepreneurial startup with the extraordinary industrial scale production expertise, supply chains of Europe's both Mittelstand and some of the very large industrial companies. So I think in the long run, we will definitely see some startups scale and grow into being completely sort of integrated large companies. Sometimes people use the expression neo-prime to really say that's what they're looking for. But I think in many instances, what we will see is startups in really productive partnerships with some of the large industrial companies. And part of my particular goal and focus for NIF in the coming years is to couple that innovation with industrial scale, industrialization. And there are some good examples of that, I think, coming down the piece. So we see Tekeva building a factory in the UK. So they're a Portuguese drone manufacturing company. They were one of our early investments. They're actually one of our first unicorn companies. And so they're definitely vertically integrating into industrial production. On the other hand, Kraken, which is an autonomous sort of boat company, is working with Leusen and then Rheinmetall on production. So that's a really nice example of a sort of synergy that really enables a company to scale more rapidly.
And is that something NIF plays a active role in sort of those introductions or suggesting those partnerships, or is that someone else does that bit of the piece?
No, so again, we take really seriously this idea that we are investing in these companies, but then we want to be on a journey with them. And particularly because of the trust that's been put into us by NATO and the allies, we have a group that we call our Mission Platform Group. And their job is to help support the companies taking those capabilities right to the Ministries of Defence or into partnership with large industrial companies. We also not only focus on capabilities, but also on security. We want to make sure that these companies are as well secured as possible. And lastly, sort of responsibility. And so those three things, sort of capability, security and responsibility, are something that we are building out real support systems in a way that I think is quite unusual. Most VCs don't do as much of that as we do.
Mm-hmm. And you recently hired several new team members, including Erin Hallock, who is formerly an investor at BP Ventures, and Ulrich Key, who was previously in corporate venture capital as well at BMW.
Yes.
Does that also tie into this, that NIF's maybe going to have a closer relationship with industry in the future?
Mm-hmm. I think the new hires that you're seeing from us, and also Sander, who has a very sort of deep tech background in semiconductors and so on, was very, very complementary to Patrick Schneider-Sikorsky, our partner, who has been doing a tremendous amount of our very early stage defence tech work. Both Ulrich and Erin bring a real understanding of large-scale industrialization. So we saw that as very, very important, the ability to help our individual companies scale themselves, but also help with those industrial partnerships. When I'm teaching at MIT, one of the exercises I do when I work between startups and corporations is an exercise that I ask the startups to play a corporate, and I ask the corporates to play a startup, and I then ask them to do a little negotiation. And what that brings to mind is just the cultural differences. How many lawyers does the corporate bring in the room? How many people in the bureaucracy? And so you really have to understand that both parties are often trying to do the best they can, but we can really act as some of that glue to bridge those two different cultures, really to the benefit of the capabilities that Europe needs.
And as I mentioned, here come the tricky questions in the intro. NIF has had a bit of a rocky start with 4 of the 5 original investment partners leaving. Why do you think that happened?
I think you said in your introduction, Amy, that NATO setting up an innovation fund, NATO creating a venture capital fund, is an extremely new and unusual thing. People were quite surprised that NATO tried to do this and thought this was important. Whenever you're trying to do something incredibly new, you don't have a template to follow, and so it's an experiment. And I think NATO identified some really incredible people to work together as early partners. But it's inevitable that as you sharpen your mission and understand what are the skill sets you really need, how do you build a well-functioning partnership, that there's going to be sort of differences of opinion. There's going to be people departing and other people coming in as we really sharpen our focus. Many of the startups I deal with see quite a lot of churn in the early stages. And so I'm not that surprised. And we're really appreciative of all the effort that people have put in. And, we know that the people who have spent time at the fund ultimately are all still part of the ecosystem, and we need to be able to work together.
How did the LPs react to the news of the departures?
I think the LPs basically understand that we, particularly as a board, are doing our best to make sure that the organisation is as stable and focused on its mission as possible. And they trust the board to make clear and effective decisions. And sometimes we have to make hard choices. And I would say as the chair that I'm always very willing to stand up and defend my choices. And I know that the LPs really, really appreciate that.
And one of the partners who left, Torsten Klaus, also took NIF to court in a legal dispute over pay recently. The NIF was ultimately ordered to pay him €52,000 as part of a bonus that it was deemed that he was owed. One thing that really stood out to me from the court case was quite how high Klaus's salary was. It was almost €700,000 per year. Why was his salary so high, and do salaries at NIF remain quite so generous?
So we have done quite a lot of industry benchmarking to make sure that we're in the right place with respect to venture capital standards. And so we have done some benchmarking down of the original salaries that were put into place as NATO was setting up the NIF. And we believe that we are now across the piece, both with our partners, our associates, and all our amazing team, at a much better, lower place with industry standards.
Still an enticing salary for someone who might be interested in joining NIF?
I think that the reason that people join NIF is really because they care deeply about the mission. At the same time, there is a marketplace for the best talent. And so we're really looking for people who are amazingly mission aligned, who care deeply about building the defence, security and resilience of the alliance and see this as a huge opportunity. And we want to pay fair market rates.
And NIF partners presumably get carry like partners in other VC funds?
They do, although the carry is structured in a way that requires them to wait very much till the end of the fund before some of that carry gets realised. And so we are putting into place incentives for very long-term engagement and behaviours as opposed to being rewarded for what happens next year.
And is that a change from how it was for the original partners, or is that something that's always been in place?
That's something that's always been in place.
And then my final tricky question. NIF has been the subject of investigations by Sifted and also the Dutch investigative outlet Follow the Money, outlining concerns from some in the industry over perceived conflicts of interest with regards to the former chair, Klaus Hommels, who's also an active investor in defence with his own fund, Lakestar, and is setting up a defence fund of his own. What would you say about that? I think it can only be described as a saga.
Yes. So NATO selected Klaus as a chair because he has a very long-standing track record in venture capital that is quite storied across Europe. He had led, I think it's the European Venture Capital Association, and was deeply committed, I think, to NATO and a very strong and resilient future of Europe. And he, has provided extraordinary service to NIF in the early days. He basically stepped down when he wanted to pursue some of his own once he became deeply involved in some of his own defence investing. But we're incredibly appreciative that he's still providing us with guidance and advice through our advisory council. And I was really honoured to basically take over this role as chair. I mean, it's an extraordinary opportunity that we have.
And you don't believe there were any conflicts of interest?
I do not. I've been part of the board since the setup, and we have extremely effective conflict of interest processes. And I can give everybody assurance that I have not observed any kind of conflicted behaviour.
Let's turn to some bigger picture topics. NIF was set up after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022, when less than 5% of European VC funding went into defence tech. And there were, I believe, no dedicated defence VC funds, and now we have many. This huge boom in defence tech funding and innovation that we've seen in recent years has also obviously been driven by growing concerns over the threat posed by Russia. How real do you think that threat is?
I mean, I think the threat is extremely real. And if I ever had any doubt, then I would simply have to read what the Secretary General said yesterday. He said, to be crystal clear about the threat, we are Russia's next target and we are already in harm's way. I believe that's true. I have no reason to doubt him. I think that has been quite clear if you are paying attention to defence. And if you're also looking at the grey zone conflict that has been going on for a long period of time, if you look at the incursions that Russia has been making across borders, if you look at the sort of drone flights and really the sort of provocation, if you look at how the threats to some of our infrastructure through things like the underwater cables and also a lot of the activity up in the Arctic, you can really begin to see, I think, tensions rising very strongly and an absolute focus, not just defence in the sort of narrow sense of of a sort of hot conflict, but actually also this ongoing grey zone, which is why we are focused on defence, security and resilience. We absolutely need resilient infrastructure, whether everything from the cables on the seabed all the way up to communications and satellites.
And what do you think are the sort of key things Europe needs to do on those kind of grey areas, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's, the increased uptick we see in, Copenhagen airport shut because of drones, Heathrow, drone scare, that seems to be mounting. What are all the different ways where, okay, this isn't an active conflict, but it's not ideally how things would be playing out? What are and can European governments do in those areas?
Yeah. I think the most important thing we can do is make sure that we have the technologies that keep our infrastructure resilient and safe. So that means that we need to ensure that our underwater cables are protected, they're repairable, they're secure, and we also have really clear warning systems about whether they are a threat. We need to ensure that we have resilient space-based communications and that we have redundancy. The challenge with being resilient to these kinds of grey zone threats is it's quite expensive because it's not as obvious as saying there's this many drones coming towards us, we need this many counter drones, or we need to build a counter UAS system, although we know we have to do that. Some of this means we are needing to buy insurance, if you like, for our systems. We need to have backup systems. We need to have more resilient supply chains. We need to have second source manufacturing. And those things will cost us money, but in the long run, they will actually make sure that we're more safe. And so we're very focused not only on the defence part of defence, security and resilience, but also on the security and resilience part. But we need our governments to really step up and be willing, if you like, to price resilience, to price it in, and to really encourage startups and large companies to invest in some of those new solutions.
And would you say governments are more focused on the defence part, you said, was it hot aggression? I can't remember the phrase you used. Hot war end of the spectrum rather than, is it harder to convince people to spend money to invest in monitoring their undersea cables or whatever it is?
I think at the moment we've got this really important sort of moment that really happened in The Hague at the NATO summit, which was when all the NATO allies committed to this significant increase in defence spending. And the 3.5% is very much focused on sort of classic defence spending, although new types of technologies. And again, we're seeing more in the sort of drone and large numbers of small things, but also very sophisticated new sort of weapon systems and defence systems. The other 1.5% you might call sort of security and resilience. That requires long-term investment. It's actually, I think, one of the places where we're going to get the sort of economic growth. But it does also mean asking companies to behave differently. A lot of that investment is going to be made not just by governments, but it's going to have to be made by companies. So if I own that undersea cable, I've got to make that investment. So I think it's going to take longer for governments to work out which levers to pull to make sure that that sort of thing is happening.
And what do you think that will look like? Will that be regulation primarily, or how else, will the kind of responsibility for this kind of resilience and security be spread?
So some of that will be regulation. Some of it will be pricing. So I think there's quite a lot of different market signals that the government can basically send. So the government will be able to say, when you are developing batteries that use, for example, critical minerals that are produced by allies and partner nations, we will be willing to pay you more because that reduces our vulnerabilities. We're seeing, for example, in the United States, something called the Blue Book, which basically says these drones, which are made with domestic parts, are then in the Blue Book, which means you can procure them. And so I think we'll see more mechanisms like that. And as companies begin to recognize the increasing cost of, for example, cyber threat, it will become more and more, I think, a discussion in boardrooms. So we really are beginning to see boardrooms taking this extremely seriously. And the geopolitical context makes a huge difference to companies. And I also think in the long run, we'll start to see the stock market, again, price in companies that are more resilient, because we know the cost when you're not.
Are there concrete signals of that already? I'm thinking of, 4 years ago when, lots of climate reporting became a key part of what big companies have to do. Is that something companies are having to do with regards to the resilience of their supply chain, the resilience of the security of their IT infrastructure? Are we seeing big organisations clock onto that, or do you think there's still a bit of a way to go there?
We're seeing boardroom discussions about those topics, about that whole set of resilience questions that come about because of this geopolitical sort of shift. And I think the sort of much more complex geopolitical landscape that we are inhabiting. And as the boards try to get out ahead of that, I think what we will also see is government starting to say, you need to sort of report on these topics. We've seen that shift in things like cybersecurity. I think we will see that in a broader set of resilience questions. We'll see that coming also through from, say, the insurance companies and reinsurance. So we'll start to see this coming from many places. And we will also see NATO and other organizations, I think, step forward in the financial markets and say, this is important. This is a key part of what it means to be a responsible financial institution, not only to invest in these things, but to make sure that the companies that are on your stock exchange and elsewhere are really as resilient and protected as they can be.
What are Europe's biggest weaknesses at the moment? Where are the biggest fault points?
So I would say that we have some really significant. If you look at the infrastructure that Europe has for the jobs that we have, for the products that we produce, the services that we're providing, some of the weaknesses we have are in our supply chains. So many of those supply chains flow incredibly significantly and densely through China. We've seen that those supply chains can become weaponized sometimes when China will decide to put certain companies on some sort of sanction list. So I think that's a fairly significant dependency that we have in Europe that we will start to have to, I think, titrate back to something that is more Europe-wide. We have weaknesses in the underwater cables. I believe there was a quite long and actually really interesting FT report about that the other day, which I think is well worth reading if you look at both the extent of those cables and their vulnerability. So we have some physical infrastructure weaknesses. And if you look at the huge sort of shift towards AI and the associated data centers, I think we must make sure that those data centers are well protected physically, but also from some of the cyber threats. And then that actually our use of AI is also protected. So that's a future weakness that I think if we don't get out ahead of that now by thinking about AI security and taking that incredibly seriously, we risk having these kinds of conversations about AI and wish that we'd done something sooner.
And where's the biggest potential for startups or innovative new tech players to play a role in all of this that we've been talking about?
I mean, actually, every single thing that I've outlined, I could sort of think of a few interesting startup companies that are trying to do something. So we have some extremely interesting companies. We have one in our portfolio, which is called Kongsberg Ferrotech, that works on the sort of surveillance and repair of underwater cables and underwater infrastructure. We see a whole set of companies focused on both supply chain provenance, sort of where are goods and services flowing, but also on trying to bring really key supply chain components back to Europe and to partners. So I think in each of these areas, there's lots of opportunity for startups. The key is whether or not that startup can get the capital it needs to scale. Because none of those solutions are particularly useful if I can only make 1 or 10 or 100 of them. When I'm trying to protect infrastructure or build a really resilient and secure set of data centers, or frankly, sort of secure AI, I'm going to have to be able to produce my solutions at massive scale. And that requires not only an innovation mindset, but an industrialization mindset. And so I think that's the key, is can these companies scale?
And where are the biggest challenges there? Does it come down to funding primarily? Is it sometimes, I imagine, lots of these companies, they're software, but they're also often hardware, and that is, as everyone knows, harder often to fund, harder to make the case for, especially if you're reliant on venture capital. What needs to be put in place with the, I guess, funding roadmap for those companies to enable them to scale?
So at the end of the day, when you have a market, then the funding tends to line up. So the first thing we need to make sure of is that the large companies that need to be the customers for some of this do have the incentives, do recognise that these things are important, which is why the government also plays a role in sending those signals into the market. But even then, we need that capital stack, as we often talk about it, to really line up. And I think that capital stack is beginning to be really well functioning when it comes to the early stages, the sort of seed and Series A and increasingly Series B capital. The place where we still have work to do is on the later stage, when, particularly in hardware, as you've said, when we need to write larger checks, we've got to find the financing for the $100 million round or the $200 million. And we also need to be quite sophisticated with debt financing and supply chain financing. We've seen some really interesting work in the United States around that, but it's still very expensive, particularly in industries and companies that are seen as being in the defense sector. There are still frictions and costs associated with that. We've just put out some work that shows that banks still find it really, really difficult to bank those companies, and the cost of capital is high. I see new initiatives like the Defence Security and Resilience Bank and other sort of financial innovations, if you like, coming to the fore to try and reduce the cost of capital, and a whole series of efforts to try to make sure that, again, these frictions are reduced. As defence becomes destigmatized, as I might describe it, we need to make sure that we reduce some of the frictions while still being really thoughtful about responsible use.
Where's some of the biggest stigma remain? That wasn't a very eloquent question, but where are
Yes.
what are some of the industries, whether it's insurance or banking, that maybe are still most wary of working with these companies and making it hard for them to scale?
So for some of the very large banks, it still becomes complex, because while the CEO might have decided that investing in focusing on banking, defence, security and resilience companies is a really important thing for them to do, quite a lot of the KYC, right, the know your customer, anti-money laundering, all the sort of infrastructure of banking is still very complex, and a defence company will raise a red flag in any one of those. And if you multiply all those small frictions together, so you sort of in the middle of the banking system, I think we have a series of challenges around simply banking. We also have challenges around the credit rating. So you're automatically sort of marked down, if you like, if you are in a sector that is labelled as defence. So that would be one category. And then we also are still seeing in things like pension funds, a real sort of set of question marks about whether or not those pension funds can serve as limited partners into funds at any scale that are focused on defence, security and resilience. There's still, I think, a nervousness about whether that is seen as being an appropriate use of sort of pension owners' money, not because we don't think that there'll be extraordinary returns, but because it has traditionally been seen in a very negative light. So I think that stigma still exists, although we're absolutely seeing a shift away from saying, you shall not do that, to actually the opposite, which is it is sort of a duty and an incredibly important thing, as well as being something that is financially really powerful to be investing in these areas.
What do you think's driving that shift most? Is it the fact that governments have sort of lent into this so much, or is it because every one of us can read the news and recognises that we're not quite in the same world we were in 5 or so years ago? Or is it, there's loads of money to be made?
I'll speak for myself and say that I think when you turn on the news, it's really difficult not to recognise that we are in incredibly conflicted times, that there is war and conflict and complexity in the world. and that we have an absolute duty, if we want to keep the next generation and the next generation safe, we're going to have to be in a sort of both a defensive position and sometimes be ready to fight a war. The best way to stop that from happening is to actually be incredibly strong and have made very, very strong investments. And so I see this very much as a public response and a sort of whole of society response that recognises that we absolutely are coming out of a sort of an obvious peacetime into a time that is much more conflictual, and we should be investing in everything that we need to make a difference.
And when it comes to NIF's investments, you've obviously outlined today a whole suite of areas where we could do with more innovation, we could do with more companies. Is it a case of NIF scans what's out there and invests in the best, or do you also kind of work on theses and then work with innovation departments of universities, or how much is it kind of bottom up versus top down in terms of how you find the companies you think we need?
So we're obviously always looking for the best companies out there in the market. We do try to find them very early so that we can help shape the direction, and part of our work on capabilities and capacity is about doing that. But we work very closely with NATO to understand, again, the NATO sort of signals, the market signals, NATO's needs. NATO themselves are doing a tremendous amount of work in that area. So that is quite top down, asking what effectively NATO's shopping list might look like for the coming year, 5 years and decade. If we don't see companies in those areas, it's very much the role of our kind of cousin organisation, NATO Diana, which stands for the Defence Innovation Accelerator of the North Atlantic. They put forward challenges that are trying to draw in very early stage startup companies to sort of shift towards some of those particularly interesting areas. And so we hope that both through our discussions, the things that we're learning from NATO are going out and looking, but also through Diana, that we'll start to get that more bottom-up early-stage companies. And then we're very much in the position to invest early and really help grow and support them to industrial scale.
What's on NATO's shopping list at the moment?
NATO shopping list, I think, is getting longer by the minute as life gets more complicated. But certainly things around counter-UAS. I mean, we know that drones and all kinds of unmanned aerial systems are extremely threatening, and we've seen all these incursions. And there are many ways, right, to counter that. And some you might think of on a battlefield are really obvious. You might want to shoot them down. But obviously, if you're over an airport, you need some very different technologies. And so there's a huge suite of technologies that we need to pay attention to. And NATO also cares really deeply, I think, about maritime autonomy, sort of security in the maritime domain. Think about how hard it is to protect a land border. The oceans are absolutely huge. And obviously, as the UK, we think about that particularly as an island nation. And last, I'd say, increasingly, we have to operate in very extreme environments, whether that's up in the Arctic, whether it's in the deep ocean, whether it's in space. So there's a tremendous amount of long-term innovation that's required for us to be able to really operate in and protect those very extreme environments. So we're really interested in supporting on those fronts.
Well, we've seen as you mentioned, we've seen a huge amount of funding channeled towards drones in particular, and often very little funding heading to other areas like perhaps critical materials, which you've also mentioned. What do you think's most overfunded and what's most underfunded at the moment?
So I would say at the moment, we have probably seen, as you've said, a lot of money going into drone startups. I think the key now will be consolidation and increasing the amount of money into the handful of those startups that are really producing the sorts of resilient, robust capabilities that have been demonstrated to be extremely effective, particularly in conflict. And so what I think we'll see is more money going into drones, but at a later stage, and trying to help those companies scale. We will definitely see a shift, I believe, away from some of the UAS systems into sort of maritime. I think that's going to be very important. But this investment in this long-term resilience in supply chains and critical minerals and some of the foundations of building more resilient economies is where I think we still have underinvestment, and where I think we'll see more investment. We have to be quite patient. We're very lucky at NIF that our time horizon is 15 years, which is much longer than your average venture capital fund. And that was a very deliberate design choice, which means that we can invest in companies now knowing that it might take longer for them to get to some of the sorts of scale and exit that we absolutely need. But this focus on building resilient sort of infrastructure in the broader sense is where I think we need more capital.
And do you think that's because the markets aren't quite there yet, and so the venture capitalists and even some of those startups themselves haven't got in on that opportunity yet?
I think a few things. First is that we often need very deep tech to do that. And so deep tech takes longer, and it's typically been underinvested in because investors, find it easier to make returns elsewhere, but also it's quite complex and has this long time horizon. The other thing is, until very recently, we really haven't recognised the value of resilience. And as we start to recognise its value, as we start to be required to invest in it, and as we start to sort of price in the benefits of resilience, then the market will catch up, I believe.
And you hinted at this with regards to drones just now, but what do you think we'll see in terms of M&A over the next year or two in the defence sector?
The professor in me always comes back to, when I look at the early auto industry, about 1,000 or 1,200 companies in the auto industry in the 1920s in the United States and beyond, and we saw huge consolidation. I think we will definitely see consolidation here. We'll start to see M&A. We'll start to see, I think, a lot of partnerships. So the first stage will be partnerships when people have complementary technologies. Some companies won't make it, and that's normal. If every single company was successful, we wouldn't be taking as much risk as we should. And I think we will see some acquisition as some of the larger companies begin to build a completely sort of integrated autonomous stack. And they want to have solutions at every scale, so in every domain, from sort of air all the way down through to deep sea, and also in the air, particularly over different sorts of ranges. And so I think we will start to see some consolidation there as well. The question we're going to have is, where is all this going to be manufactured? Will every country want to have its own manufacturing facilities, or are we going to be able to take advantage of some, sort of comparative advantage across different parts of Europe? Because
that's a real limiting factor for some of these, as you mentioned, the kind of neo-primes, the Helsing, the quantum systems, the ISI, as if they want to work with governments all over Europe, but those governments mandate that they build their drones or their spaceports or whatever it is in those countries, that's going to limit them in a way that an AI company or a software company doesn't have, right? Yes. And so I think there are two things. So one is making sure that markets are interoperable, so that if you buy something, it's on a platform that I can also use and that we can share. And so we don't have a classic problem of, your rail gauge is different to mine, and so the train gets stuck at the border. And so we need to make sure that the platforms we build are interoperable. And that will allow for companies to sell across many different markets. And then the second half of the question is where things are produced. And it's certainly the case that countries would like to have factories that are domestic. Some of that is obviously for jobs, and some of that is for sort of resilience, being able to control your own destiny. That is much harder for Europe. It's not a problem that the US has to deal with. But I think over time, what we will find is that in each of these different domains, countries will have different specializations. And so we'll be able to deal with having, a factory in maybe 3 countries selling into others. But conversely, your country will get to do something different. And so I do believe that all of Europe will benefit, but it will require some coordination. And what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for those neo-primes we've mentioned? I think for the neo-primes, the challenge will really be in industrialization. Building things at scale in ways that are incredibly reliable, while at the same time continuing to innovate fast, will be hard. Every large company finds it difficult. As they get bigger, they become more bureaucratic. Every single startup says it won't become more bureaucratic, and yet the act of growing an organization is one of, frankly, building a bureaucracy so that you have repeatable processes. And so I think one of the main things that they will have is retaining that sense of ingenuity and adaptation, while also perfecting the ability to make certain things at massive scale. So I think even as the neo-primes grow, they will need to continue to work with some of the startups and make sure that they're incredibly good partners.
I sometimes think about the pharmaceutical industry as a quite interesting model where the large pharmaceutical companies have been able to be very good partners with some of the smaller, more agile biotech companies. And if we can start to see a sort of an ecosystem like that evolve, I think we'll be in a much more resilient position.
Final question. If, fingers crossed, there are no more wars that break out, everything calms down, there are no drone attacks, the undersea cables get left in peace, what use could or will all this defence tech innovation have? What are the sort of knock-on effects for other industries or for economies, societies in general?
Mm-hmm. So first, I hope that your prediction that everything will be calm and quiet will come true. Sadly, I don't think it will. But I will say that most of the defence technologies have a dual purpose. They are dual use should the companies wish to deploy them in other markets. If you look at, for example, drones and some of the robotics work that's being done, some of the most extraordinary sort of four-legged drones that are used on land are incredibly important in making our civilian factories more efficient. If you look at some of the software that allows for autonomy, things that you might need to be autonomous on a battlefield will also allow us to be much more autonomous and frankly safe when we use things on the roads. Our ability to build sort of resilient pipelines and underwater cables and infrastructure, I think, will also make our infrastructure more resilient to the impacts of climate change. We know that when we're producing technology that works in the Arctic, that's going to be important because that is going to become more navigable under conflict or not. And so most of what's happening in defence has huge spillovers. That's not a new story. We saw that after World War II. The US economy has often been driven by that. DARPA is held up as an organisation that has helped support that. And so I'm hopeful, actually, that the civilian benefits will be the ones that we come back and talk about because we don't need them in a defence context. But if we do, we've got the capacity to really deploy them at pace.
Thank you so much, Fiona. This has been absolutely fascinating. I could have asked you an hour's worth more questions, but we've got other things to do. So thank you, everyone, for listening. Please keep listening weekly for more interviews with the movers and shakers of Europe's tech ecosystem. Please rate, review and share this podcast if you enjoyed it. And this podcast was produced, as ever, by the very wonderful Maya de Rampel Hornby.